So by the beginning of 1915, most of the movement on the Western Front was pretty much over. The movement occurred in Battle of the Marne and a few other places, and things had pretty well solidified by the end of 1914, beginning of 1915. That frustrated the commanders to no end, as it seemed like there was this unbeatable just stoppage of the war activity in which there were tons of battles, but none of them seemed to make a huge difference. And again, it goes back to what we said in the last unit. It was 19th century thinking with 20th century weapons. It's not that the generals were stupid and they just wanted to have a bunch of their troops murdered. That was kind of the popular notion of what we think of the First World War now, and looking at it in hindsight, that's certainly how it seems. At the time, though, there were all kinds of different ways that they tried to think around the problem of the front's stabilization, and there were numerous attacks in which different tactics were tried. They tried attacking in different waves. They tried timing their attacks differently. They tried changing around the timing of the artillery barrages. They tried changing the angle of the assaults when they'd move out of the trenches. But given the status of the weapons, there just wasn't really a way, given their technology, that they could break through. They hadn't realized it yet. Well, some generals did, but it was essentially a war of attrition where whoever has the most resources in any part of the front is going to get the upper hand. To the extent there was still 19th century thinking, is the commanders tended to focus a lot on taking certain little areas, and so a lot of the fighting occurred at two particular areas. One was the Ypres salient. There were something like 4 battles of Ypres throughout the entire war. And the salient just means the little budge in the front here, a little bulge there, like a pimple. Essentially, a lot of the action would take place around those little juts out in the front, and they'd try to penetrate deeper or go around them somehow. Another important salient was called the Saint Mihiel salient down here nearby Verdun, and a lot of the German focus was trying to get around and to try to penetrate this salient more, to try to get around Verdun and take that fortress. Was considered strategically, or not strategically important, but important for morale. And then a lot of this northern Belgium region. Arras was another area where a lot of the fighting took place, and there was an extraordinary amount of death fighting over a few miles one direction or the other around these salients. So everything the generals tried, though, didn't really work, and what they did figure out is that they could, for the most part, keep what they had. And so there'd occasionally be attacks that would work. One side would take the other's trenches, but then the other side would take it back after a few weeks or a couple months. So there were numerous offensives, but none of them really worked out. And so really 1914 and 15 were an attempt to try to figure out, okay, how can we break through this? I've had some students ask, why didn't they just go around the ocean and just go back behind the front here and do an amphibious landing like D-Day or something? And that wouldn't have worked for a couple of reasons. One, it would violate neutral Holland, and the Allies weren't willing to do that. You couldn't go any further east, or else you'd get into the heavily protected areas of northern Germany. And also, they're just the technology necessary for those kinds of operations just wasn't there. We're going to see in the Dardanelles or the Gallipoli campaign, when they The Allies tried a amphibious operation, and it just failed spectacularly despite all the resources they threw at it. And so there was really no going around. To the south of the front was Switzerland and all the mountains. To the north was the North Sea, and that's where all the German Navy was protecting the German ports. So there wasn't any getting around the front unless you could somehow punch through it. And they tried and tried, but didn't succeed. And the outcome was just extraordinary destruction. What the soldiers wrote about what all the shelling did to the land was just shocking. It turned it into a kind of moonscape. So life on the Western Front was a very peculiar type of fighting, again, because there's a lack of offensive excitement. There was a lot of defensive terror. So we look at the pictures like this, and we don't have, there's a lot of pictures and video of World War One, but not a ton of it. One thing that I think people mistake about it is that they were ditches that just went in a big line. You look at the line of the front, and it's like, well, it's a big line of two ditches with a few hundred yards separating them. That's really not how they were. The front line trenches were sometimes ditches, but behind them would be this quite complicated network of partially underground or fully underground support systems and communications networks and so forth. So there were about 5,000 men per mile on the front on average, and they spent a lot of their time constructing the defensive networks. The German trenches were generally a little bit more sophisticated than the Allied ones, since the French and British tended to be more offensive, trying to expel the German soldiers from their country, and the Germans were more defensive-minded. And so the German trench system, this is an image of the French here. The German trench system was somewhat more sophisticated than the British and French were, which would have been a little bit more like ditches. But they weren't the same everywhere. In the north part of the front, up toward Flanders, Belgium, it was too muddy to really dig a proper ditch, and so it was more of a sandbag configuration. Then further south, it was more kind of these deep trenches. There'd be rows of them, and so in the front row you'd have a certain number of riflemen and a certain number of machine gunners. Life in these trenches were particularly bad, so the front line would be, generally those weren't where you slept. That was where you'd try to snipe at the other side or defend against attacks, and there'd be a support trench where there'd be more living quarters. And the soldiers would rotate in and out periodically. The generals did tend to look down on the normal soldiers. A lot of the generals on both sides came from either professional or aristocratic backgrounds. Most of the soldiers came from either the lower-end working classes or the agricultural working classes. The generals did to some extent think their soldiers were expendable, but even they realized that no human could put up with these conditions for long. There was constant noise from the shelling. The war was dominated by artillery barrages, and so you dealt with this constant din of explosions. It was nasty and dirty, and a lot of the front was muddy. It rained a lot for whatever reason. The weather was rainier than usual in that part of Europe, and northwestern Belgium really is kind of an estuary. So if you think of the Mississippi Delta region of the U.S., it was already muddy, and then it just rained more. So mud was a serious problem. That caused a lot of health issues like trench foot, which was a fungal infection that troops could get and might result in having to amputate their leg. Trench mouth is where your gums and teeth would get diseased, and while your teeth would fall out. Trench fever, when the weather was warm, would be caused by the excrements of lice. Lice was something that almost all the soldiers had. Rats were a huge problem, and rats would be everywhere, and that's what a lot of the soldiers wrote about in their diaries and so forth, were just the huge number of rats that live with them, and rats would occasionally get people sick. But a trench culture emerged with certain hierarchies and language and rituals. Snipers tended to be the kind of professional elite soldiers, and sniper schools developed, and those soldiers developed kind of a rapport. Anti-sniper snipers were developed by each side when they got increasingly powerful weapons. And then there were your regular riflemen, and then the machine gunners, and so forth. There, in between the trenches, the German and the Allied trenches, there was what was called no man's land, which was basically an area that if you emerged into because you were ordered to attack, you were very likely to get killed, because the machine guns would just take you down. So that was a place which increasingly got more and more just pocked with shell craters, and an increasingly huge mess of barbed wire. One thing the troops talked about in their sources was the terror of going through no man's land and getting caught in barbed wire, and just the barbed wire tearing your legs up, and then getting stuck and getting shot or shelled. That was something that caused the troops a lot of terror. One thing the soldiers wanted more than anything was to get wounded. Not wounded in such a way that hurt you really badly, but wounded badly enough that you got to go home, but not so badly that you were permanently damaged. The British called these blighty wounds, or the Germans called them Heimatüsse, which meant home shots. There was that, so that was something you actually wanted to accomplish so you could get to go back home. The troops, the video that you're going to watch talks about some of this, developed a kind of grudging respect for each other, and in some cases kind of conspired to try to keep the killing to a minimum, which definitely upset the generals who wanted to kill as many as possible at all times. So the information we have about when troops would encounter each other, not during some kind of an offensive, they were surprisingly congenial with each other. There was also a class differential. Like I said, the commanders and the officers usually went to some kind of professional school, a lot of times college, and the common soldiers, the enlisted men, tended to come from farm families or industrial workers, and so the officers a lot of times had servants with them who would kind of keep their uniforms clean, carry stuff for them, and things like that, which definitely caused resentment, although officers tended to have a higher death rate, especially during offensives, since it was easier to pick them out. So low-level officers died in huge numbers, so it wasn't all great for them. The war went quite badly for Austria-Hungary early on. Austria-Hungary had started the war. They were the ones during the July crisis pushing for the war. They wanted to punish Serbia, and they wanted a war to happen so that they could do that. They didn't want it to be a big war, but it became a big war. And the result was very bad for Austria. So the Eastern Front went well for Germany, didn't go so well for Austria-Hungary, and the Russians ended up pushing Austria-Hungary back into their own territory, and the major battle occurred at a place called Przemysl, which is today in southern Poland. At that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was kind of the focus of Austro-Hungarian military pride, as this was an old fortress which was considered their strong point, and the Russians laid siege to it and eventually defeated it, or laid siege 3 different times. And by 1915, they succeeded in capturing it and capturing a huge amount of Austrian soldiers. Life on the Austrian front was worse for them than either the Germans or the French on the Western front, since Austria didn't have enough soldiers to rotate them in and out of the battle areas. So a lot of the soldiers were extremely fatigued, and putting up with this siege at the fortress of Przemysl caused a lot of difficulty for them. And it was extremely embarrassing for the Austrians to lose that. By 1915, the Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't really a partner of Germany anymore. It was more of a subordinate, and they didn't really have the manpower to do much. They did take Serbia, or defeat Serbia, though. They did succeed in invading Serbia and defeating the Serbian army, but then a front developed a little bit south of that and turned into its own stalemate. After the first few months of the war, Austria-Hungary was focused on trying to keep itself from completely falling apart, and meant it was never able to really successfully prosecute any of the war aims, and Germany was pretty much leading everything and occasionally getting a tiny bit of help from Austria. Later on, Italy would enter the war and create another front on the Austro-Hungarian Empire's southern frontier. So Austria had started the war, but it really failed to get anything out of it, and ultimately the empire collapsed. And so it was actually within a few months it became very clear they had made an enormous mistake. So by the end of 1914, what a lot of the war's enthusiasts had said in the beginning, in August of 1914, this was going to be over in a few months, that was very much not true. It was very clear by the end of 1914 this was going to be a extremely damaging conflict with huge amounts of death for not a lot of payoff. No one exactly knew how it was going to continue, but it was going to continue very badly. And in the midst of this kind of lull period in December of 1914, Christmas rolled in, and the troops had this interesting, in certain parts of the front, and it spread across a lot of the front, much to the general's dismay. There was this fraternization between the troops on either side, where they actually emerged from no man's land, put their weapons down, and kind of had this little party or little Christmas celebration where they sung carols, and they had a soccer game, and in different parts of the front all experienced this, and it was reminiscent of kind of older style 19th century gentlemanly camaraderie. And Paul Fussell, who wrote a book about the memory of World War I, called the Christmas truce the last twitch of the 19th century, because it really was this episode of kind of 19th century culture making its last 20th century peak. A lot of the soldiers that are the junior officers and non-commissioned officers got in trouble for with their superiors for allowing this to happen, since the generals were really upset that the troops didn't attack each other and or take the other side's trench when it was vulnerable. But it demonstrated that there's a class difference going on, that there's a difference between what the average troop thinks he's fighting for and what the leadership thinks they're fighting for. Was this almost kind of hopeful moment that maybe this won't get too bad, but it wasn't the beginning of something, it was the end of something. It was the end of these 19th century values of gentlemen soldiers. That's not going to happen anymore, and this wouldn't happen. There wouldn't be any large-scale fraternization between the troops in this fashion where they all stopped fighting and had a little get-together. That wouldn't happen again for the entire war.